Breaking news tonight, most Americans don't realize the U.S. imports nearly all of its uranium. And even fewer know that Canada holds some of the world's highest grade uranium deposits. So when Washington signaled interest in expanding nuclear power for AI, national defense, and industrial energy, experts paid attention. And a critical question surfaced. What happens if Canada says no? Because that one decision could reshape energy strategy, trade relationships, and NATO cooperation for decades. Tonight, we break down a scenario already being discussed quietly by analysts behind closed doors. Tonight's reporting begins with a surprising fact. The current uranium debate has nothing to do with weapons, AI data centers, submarine fleets, semiconductor fabrication, and 24/7 manufacturing all demand steady baseload power. And while solar and wind contribute heavily to the grid, they cannot yet deliver continuous power without long-duration storage. Nuclear reactors can deliver that kind of round-the-clock power, which is why U.S. planning documents mention small modular reactors.
But here's the problem almost nobody talks about. The United States barely produces uranium anymore.
Government energy data shows the U.S. now imports roughly 95% of its uranium.
A vulnerability analysts are watching closely.
Here's where Canada enters the picture and why analysts say it holds far more leverage than most people realize. Canada isn't just another uranium producer. It's a high-tier supplier with serious nuclear expertise. One key fact stands out. Roughly 13% of global uranium output comes from Canadian mines.
Saskatchewan's Athabasca Basin produces the highest grade uranium ore on Earth, far richer than most deposits worldwide.
On top of raw resources, Canada also exports respected reactor technology, including heavy water systems used around the world.
For energy analysts, the conclusion is straightforward. If the U.S. wants large-scale nuclear expansion, Canada isn't optional, Proudings. It's strategic. So what would a U.S. request to Canada actually look like? Recent policy discussions give us a clear outline. U.S. officials have been emphasizing small modular reactors for AI data centers, electrified military bases, and critical industrial power.
Other priorities include nuclear-powered shipyards and reducing dependence on Chinese and Russian supply chains. Now imagine Washington placing a direct call to Ottawa with 3 specific asks aimed at supporting this strategy. First, long-term uranium supply guarantees. Second, fast-track nuclear fuel processing. Third, priority over Chinese and European buyers. And experts say this scenario isn't far-fetched. It's the kind of negotiation many believe could emerge in the coming decade. This is where the diplomatic side gets interesting, Traves, because Canada has more than one possible response. Option A, Canada could simply say yes as an ally, strengthening North American energy integration. Option B, Canada could say, let's negotiate, pushing for tariff relief or trade concessions in return. Option C, Canada could say no and prioritize long-term supply deals with Europe, Japan, or South Korea. And in that case, Washington faces a new problem: reduced access to a critical energy input. Suddenly, one of the most stable bilateral relationships in the Western Hemisphere turns into a geopolitical chessboard. One often overlooked angle is NATO. Its security posture assumes long-term cooperation between the United States and Canada. That cooperation underpins integrated defense supply chains and shared access to strategic resources. So if Canada distances itself from Washington economically or technologically, European capitals would pay not because of uranium alone, but because a symbolic no signals a more independent Canadian approach to strategy. For NATO observers, shifts in supply chains, resource policy, and tech infrastructure are already key discussion areas. And Canada's decisions on energy and technology would factor into that broader conversation about alliance resilience. This chapter isn't just about geopolitics, Ted. It's about the tech sector and its growing demand for electricity. Analysts estimate that AI training and data processing require enormous power, often concentrated in mass storage. One example, a single large-scale computing facility can require around 100 megawatts of multiply that by dozens or even hundreds of sites, and the demand begins to rival major cities. Without nuclear baseload power, many facilities shift toward natural gas, which can mean higher costs, higher emissions. So the uranium question doesn't end in diplomatic circles. It reaches into cloud computing, financial markets. Now consider a different scenario. Canada signs long-term uranium supply agreements with Europe or key Asian buyers. Analysts argue that if Ottawa goes that route, the United States could face reduced access to Canadian supply. That would likely translate into higher costs and slower timelines for nuclear deployment and energy infrastructure. For the tech sector, that means delayed power solutions for AI data centers and advanced computing workloads. Meanwhile, Canada could gain new diplomatic positioning as a middle power with more diversified partnerships. In that scenario, Canada isn't anti-US, Vigada. It's simply acting independently, which carries major geopolitical. After all the data points, 3 strategic facts stand out at the center of this story. First, the United States needs uranium if it intends to expand nuclear power for energy and computing. Second, Canada remains one of the safest and most stable uranium suppliers in the global market. And third, resource leverage shapes alliances terrain. It's not just about economics, it's about strategy. How Washington and Ottawa communicate could influence NATO cohesion, AI infrastructure, and industrial capacity. That reaches into semiconductor manufacturing, energy pricing, naval power projection chronon, and the broader. So here's the central question. Should the U.S. treat Canadian uranium as a shared North American security priority? Or will Washington simply assume access until Canada forces a different discussion? In a world shaped by AI, energy, and geopolitics, a single resource can influence the strategic balance. For deeper coverage on energy security and geopolitics, subscribe and tap the bell. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.